Good evening. I'm Mary Pat Higgins. I'm the president and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and it is such a pleasure to welcome you here tonight for the first session of our Crucial Conversation series on challenging anti-Semitism. I'd like to start by thanking our generous sponsors for tonight's program and reception, Ronit and Haviv Alon. We're truly grateful for your support. It was so nice to have a reception and be able to visit with each other, so thank you, Ronit and Haviv. I'd also like to thank an incredible list of community partners for this series, so bear with me, the list is longer than usual. Our community partners are ADL Texoma, Congregation Anshe Torah, Dallas After School, Green Hill School, Jewish Federation of Greater Dallas, Southwest Jewish Congress, Temple Emmanuel, Temple Shalom, and the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Commission. We're very grateful to partner with such committed and engaged local organizations. And as always, I'd like to give a very warm welcome to our museum board members, our volunteers, and our generations members. We could not do programming like this without your support, and I am always tremendously grateful. If you're not a member or a volunteer and would like to get engaged, please go to our website, dhhrm.org. We would love to get you engaged. We desperately need more volunteers. So if you're interested tonight in the impact we're having, please consider helping us reach the 190,000 students that we're impacting this year, and we are poised to almost double that next year. I'm happy to report that just today, Fort Worth ISD signed an agreement to start our Upstander partnership for the next 2 years, so that adds 71,000 students. Very excited. We've been working on that for a bit, so it was nice to get that today. So tonight you're here for Crucial Conversations. We started this series in 2020 to discuss and address pervasive issues in our country. And at that time, the first program was focused on racism. This is the second time that we have done this series focused on challenging anti-Semitism. It's a complex, ugly, and deeply rooted hatred that has existed for millennia and underlies much of the content in our Holocaust Shoah wing of the museum's permanent exhibition. As a Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, we are intimately familiar with the historical consequences of anti-Semitism, which is fueled by hatred, racism, conspiratorial thinking, and scapegoating, to name a few of its causes. Attacks on Jews, both verbal and physical, are reported daily across the world and have been growing over the past decade or more. We cannot be complacent or silent with virulent anti-Semitism still prevalent in our world. Tonight, we will start the conversation by establishing a base of knowledge on contemporary anti-Semitism. In our second session, which is in May, we will discuss anti-Semitism on college and university campuses before concluding the series in June with a session on strategies to combat anti-Semitism. We will have time for question and answers from the audience. Please write your questions on the note cards that you received when you were coming into the audience, and our staff and volunteers will come around and collect those, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. If you're joining us virtually, please write your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will also get to those questions. I'd also like to ask you tonight to focus your questions on tonight's content. I know we're all very focused on what's happening on colleges, but we'll have that second session in May. So let's try to focus tonight our questions on what's covered in the conversation. And I'd also like to ask you to silence your cell phones so we can all enjoy this conversation without disruptions. It's now my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speakers. I know that many of you read the email that we sent. We were delighted to have Dr. Michael Berenbaum on the panel. Unfortunately, American Airlines was not working with us today. He sat on the tarmac for quite a while in LA, but we've gotten news that his plane has landed and that he will be able to join us at the end of our conversation for closing remarks. So I'm thrilled that Michael will be able to join us. He's a special friend of the museum's because he was the curator for our permanent exhibition. And so he is responsible for much of the work that we do. So I'm excited that you all will get to meet him later if you haven't yet met him. We've also, because of Michael's delay, changed our panel just a bit. We will have panelist Dr. Charles Asher Small, who was always planned to be a panelist. He's the founding executive director of the Institute for Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, also known as ISCAP. That's how Texans say it. You'll have to tell us, Charles, if that's wrong. Small has convened groundbreaking academic seminar series, conferences, and programming in the emerging field of contemporary anti-Semitism studies at top-tier universities around the world. He was the founding director of the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism, the first interdisciplinary research center on anti-Semitism at a North American university. He's the author of numerous books and articles and has served as a consultant and policy advisor in North America, Europe, South Africa, and the Middle East. And we're delighted that our local Dr. David Patterson, who had planned to be the moderator, will now be a panelist. Dr. Patterson holds the Hillel A. Feinberg Distinguished Chair in Holocaust Studies at the Ackerman Center at the University of Texas at Dallas. He's a senior research fellow for the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, ISCAP. He's a winner of the National Jewish Book Award and has published more than 40 books and more than 250 articles, essays, and book chapters on anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and Jewish studies. We're so fortunate to have this scholar here in our community. And I am especially pleased that the museum has a pretty strong bench. And our moderator tonight will be Dr. Sarah Abosh Jacobson. Sarah is the museum's Barbara Rabin Chief Education Officer, where she is responsible for all content-related matters. Dr. Abosh Jacobson holds a PhD in modern European and Jewish history and master's degrees in modern British and Jewish history and political science with a concentration in civil military relations, and both from the University of Buffalo. If you are on our board or have been around the museum for a while, you know that Sarah has a mind like a steel trap. So we're excited to have her moderating this panel tonight. And now it's my pleasure to turn the evening over to Sarah. Sarah, David, and Charles.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening for what I hope will be, and actually I'm pretty darn certain will be, a very interesting conversation. It's not an easy conversation to have, but I think given what's going on in the United States and in the world right now, it's a very important series of conversations to have. So I think what we're going to do, gentlemen, is just kick it right off. Let's start with defining anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism, as you know, is often referred to as the world's longest hatred. And it has persisted in various forms for 3,500 years, give or take. Let's start by asking each of you to define anti-Semitism, and then we'll go from there. So, and I know that different people define it in different ways. So why don't we'll go reverse order. We'll start with David, and then you move to you, Charles, and then we'll go back and forth like that. So David.
Well, I think one good definition in one word is demonizing the Jews, lying about the Jews, inciting hatred of the Jews. Anti-Semitism is rooted in discourse of demonization, so which is dehumanization. So it legitimizes doing violence against the Jews, your contempt for the Jews. It even requires contempt for the Jews if you want to be counted among the righteous, whether it's Christian, jihadist, or ideological.
So I would say, I'll give you the history of anti-Semitism in 2 minutes, so forgive me. But I'd say
Please do.
But I'd say that anti-Semitism is inherently genocidal, which makes it a different type of hatred than other forms of hate, despite how horrific and damaging other forms of hate and discrimination could be. Anti-Semitism is unique in that it's inherently genocidal. And what I mean by that, there were basically 3 general phases of anti-Semitisms with an S. There was the religious phase of anti-Semitism, mainly the Christian phase of anti-Semitism. And during the Christian phase of anti-Semitism, the Jew was demonized because they didn't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah. So the teachings were that the Jew was blinded by evil and by the devil, and they couldn't have redemption. This is the individual Jew. But what makes it inherently genocidal is the belief that the Jews were holding up redemption and holding up the bringing of a messianic age. And until the Jew would be converted or changed or civilized, the world would remain in this sort of space that we're in now. So you blame the Jew, and this gave rise to pogroms, forced conversion, exile, and all sorts of violence. When the gaze shifted predominantly from the religious phase to the racist phase, to the phase where national identity, ethnic identity, racial identities were rooted in biologically determined notions, where Western civilization, the theologians, the philosophers, the social scientists, the professors of biology and eugenics, mainly in Europe, taught that race was something innate, deep in our characteristics. No matter if you convert or you master language or you master culture, you were intrinsically rooted in a racial identity. And the Jew was defined as not white and poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. And unlike the Christian phase where the Jew could be converted or exiled, the racial phase of anti-Semitism gives rise to Nazism. And in this phase, the Jew had to be eliminated. And David tells stories about how the Nazis would send, a whole division to the Arctic because there was reports that there were like 5 or 6 Jews in the Arctic, and the goal was to eliminate the entire race to save the white Aryan race. Today, the dominant phase of anti-Semitism is an attack on who we are as a people. And this, again, is also rooted in a genocidal form of anti-Semitism. And we see this happening not just among the radical Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm not speaking about Islam. I'm speaking about political Islam, extreme Islam. The Muslim Brotherhood, which starts 100 years ago, fuses European anti-Semitism and Nazism, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, as a core element of this social movement. So it takes a perversion of Islam, fuses it with European anti-Semitism and Nazism, and now is trying to eliminate the self-determination of the Jewish people on our land. That's the radical Islamist. And then you have the radical left postmodern intellectuals in our little sphere of life. From the classroom, they're teaching that the Jews are white. Right, Judith Butler, Edward Said, were colonial, occupying, white expansionists. So the Judith Butlers, the philosophers, Edward Said, are now teaching that the Jews are white. So in less than 2 generations, the intellectuals were defining the Jew as not white and legitimizing the extermination of the Jewish people. Today, the intellectuals are saying that the Jews are white, but unfortunately, it's not welcome to the club, and we're so terribly sorry for what happened to you. In less than 2 generations, we've gone from not being white and hunted and exterminated to the great intellectuals at our best universities in this country teaching for 40 years that the Jews are white and that we're racist and we're colonialists and we're occupiers and we are apartheid supporters and we're Nazis. So now if Israel is an occupying, apartheid, racist, fascist entity, and we in this room support it, well, then again, we've become, in less than 2 generations, an enemy of all that is good and decent. So it goes from the classroom to the encampments, into our streets, into our society. And this, ladies and gentlemen, again, and I'm choosing my words carefully as a scholar, this is a genocidal, anti-Semitic social movement. From political Islam to our finest universities and the media of record in this great democratic country, the United States of America. And this is what we are facing today.
Okay. Excellent. Very, very good tour of the horizon. So let's take this a little bit further. You're talking about genocidal elements. You're talking about the targeting of Jews first as a religious grouping, then as a racial, ethnic grouping, subsequently as a hyper-white grouping. I mean, all of these things. What neither of you is really pointing to, and what I would ask you each to speak a little bit about, and we'll start with David now, is what leads to this? In other words, what is it about the Jew or the Jews that puts us into this position? I don't mean us as a Jew, I mean us as human beings. What leads to this? Because you're missing that part, and I think a lot of academics do. So,
Well, what is the anti-Semite anti exactly? As you say, what are the Nazis trying to annihilate in the annihilation of the Jews, or the jihadists, or whoever is bent on the extermination of the Jews? What are they trying to get rid of? The Nazis claimed, Alfred Rosenberg, Nazi ideologue, they're trying to get rid of Judaism. Hitler, 1922, said his ultimate aim was to eliminate the tyrannical God of the Jews and his life-denying 10 Commandments. They're trying to eliminate the millennial teaching and tradition that the Jews represent by their presence in the world. And it's a tradition that demands an infinite responsibility from each human being. Jews are chosen to say to humanity, every individual is chosen for a responsibility and a mission that can never really be fulfilled because it's infinite in scope. So we are our brother's keeper. We want to get rid of that question, where's your brother, and put to Cain, where's your brother and what have you done? And we want to get rid of the one who asks. Our default is to go into hiding, like Adam, when he was asked, where are you? The Jews allow no sleep because the Jews are unsettling, insisting that the accounts are never settled. And what we want is to have our accounts settled. We want our redemption guaranteed. We want to have the fixed formula and ready answer. And the Jews represent a tradition of what's called machlokas, dispute, questioning. Anti-Semites are generally authoritarian and totalitarian. They do not tolerate disputes or questioning. They want the account settled. They either appropriate or usurp God. And the Jews, as long as there's a Jew in the room saying, you're not God, you're not done, you still owe something, that voice is silenced or eliminated or demonized, deemed evil. And what is, you mentioned the colonialist apartheid state, Jews are white, Jews themselves are genocidal. What is the moral requirement when we're faced with that? We have to eliminate it, right? So, I think the Jews are hated because Jews represent a question put to humanity that humanity cannot, because it concerns what is infinitely dear, can't live up to, cannot adequately answer.
Charles.
It's profound, my humble opinion. So I think I agree with what David is saying, and I really respect the tact that he takes in his work. I'm going to speak at a more political level. So what is it about the Jew? Think about the question. We know in this country we've kind of developed and we've become a little more civilized at some level, I think. We know that, from slavery to Jim Crow to the Civil Rights Movement, that we've come a long way in terms of understanding the legacy of racism. And we learned not to blame the victim. So that we know if you get a good liberal education and have awareness of how racism is structured into this country, into our language, into our cities, into our education, into the labor market, etc., that we don't ask the question, why the African Americans? That was the question. Why weren't black people successful? And the stereotypes of black people, of black men, they were lazy, but they were aggressive. And we learned when we study racism, don't look at the community or at the people that have been the victims of racism. Look at the society and the values and the political and economic and social processes which marginalizes black people. The same with sexism. We've learned in the last 40 or 50 years, if you get a good liberal education, you learn a little bit about gender inequality. And we know that if a woman was abused in this country and there was be a trial, the question would be, why was she there? What was she doing? What was she wearing? But we've progressed, not to blame the woman in the situation, and to understand how sexism is embedded in our culture, in our labor market, in our language, in our gaze, et cetera, et cetera. So we've progressed to some extent. A long way to go, but we've progressed. And yet, when it comes to anti-Semitism, we still look at the Jew. What is the Jew doing? What are we successful at, not successful? Why are they blaming us? And I say we need to take a step back. The fact that we do not study contemporary anti-Semitism in academia, we don't have the language, we don't have the critical interdisciplinary study of what's happening in society. Why is there this tremendous explosion of anti-Semitism across the United States, particularly in good liberal institutions, in the media of record, in higher education, now seeping into other sectors of our society? We have to understand what is taking place. And I think not to look at the Jew, not to look at the Israeli, but what's going on in our society. And as Elie Wiesel always taught us, that anti-Semitism begins with the Jewish people, but it never ends with the Jewish people. And it's something that is, I think, symbolic of a larger issue that's taking place in our country, in our society, in the global economy. There's a crisis, and the Jew is becoming, again, the focus of hatred. And
Okay, so let's take this a little bit further. A lot of media and pundits and even people within the academy talk about October 7th, 2023 being this before and after moment. But as we all know, I think Charlie Hebdo, I think Hyper Kasher, all kinds of things going on in Europe. I think of other things here. The Tree of Life Synagogue, like we can start there. There's much in contemporary anti-Semitism that absolutely predates October 7th. Let's go back 15, 20 years. It's a two-part question, and we'll start with you, David. The first part is, what do you think accounts for this tremendous growth that's going on already before all of what happens in Israel? And also, do you think that our distance, now 80 years from the Holocaust, has anything to do with that? Feelings of guilt, notions of memory, any of that kind of thing. It's kind of a two-part question. So,
yes, on October 7th, several forces converged. Like you said, there've been other attacks on Jews in Israel, many other terrorist attacks, right? But October 7th, in many ways, embodies at least jihadist Jew hatred. Hamas taught that killing Jews is an act of devotion to Allah. Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, taught this. That killing a Jew is your ticket into heaven. Whoever kills a Jew is guaranteed a place in paradise. October the 7th was Simchat Torah. It was Shabbat. It was Shemini Atzeret. The convergence of a moment when the Holy One, according to Jewish teaching, most intensely enters this realm. On Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar bragged about how much he learned about Yiddishkeit in the 22 years he spent in prison. So it's not as though he doesn't know what he's doing. Hamas is shouting Allahu Akbar as they are burning, beheading, raping, butchering Jews. Okay? They pray in the midst of an act that's too much to even call it murder. So it's the essence of the hatred, the justification of slaughtering Jews really came to a head on that day, number one. Number two, I think there was, on the next day, there were demonstrations around the world in support of Hamas. They weren't just out of the blue. They can't be, with all the signs ready to go. So there's a I would say even a worldwide coordination of the event. And there's a lot of money behind it. Charles and ISGAP have done astounding research on following the money, Qatari money, funding Hamas, Brotherhood, and so on. So it's more systematically coordinated, highly sophisticated, carefully timed, carefully planned. So it's like the perfect storm. And the discourse is all ready to go. The freedom fighters. Free Gaza. You see, free Gaza, right? Gaza was free on October 6th. The Israelis weren't in Gaza since 2005, right? So there's a playbook, there's a script that is followed that's calculated not to inform or even to persuade, but to incite. Haj Amin al-Husseini, one of the fathers of the Brotherhood, ideologues, influenced Arafat, Hamas, who learned a lot from Hitler, who said the purpose of propaganda is to incite wrathful hatred, which is exactly what it's calculated to do. They're well trained. It's not that suddenly people started hating Jews. It's the longest hatred, but it's much more systematic, orchestrated. There's training involved. National Students for Justice in Palestine, good example of doing workshops, how to set up the encampment, what do you do in the encampment. Finally, I'll just end with this. It creates a culture, both academic and societal, in which you cannot be counted among the righteous unless you advocate for the destruction of the Jewish state. If you think Israel should exist, you're among the damned and not the redeemed. So it's a lot of things converge. It's not that suddenly people started hating Jews. It was there.
Charles, as part of this, you had alluded in your last remarks to changes that were occurring in the academy within the West more generally, and David is taking a more of a philosophical, which I know he does, a more of a philosophical approach. Can you talk concretely about some of these changes that predate October 7th? In other words, what were those changes and how did they lead to this increase in anti-Semitism long before we get to October 7th?
Right. So in a way, if I could be concrete, it kind of boggles my mind that the American Jewish community was asleep at the wheel. There's a Chinese proverb that says you cannot wake up a dog that's pretending to sleep. And it boggles my mind that given the legacy of anti-Semitism and how deeply rooted it is in our civilization, and Western civilization in particular, that the American Jewish community and its major institutions thought that this country, that we were in this country, different from any other community, from any other country in the entire world. And when the Islamists were attacking the Israelis, wanting to wipe Israel off the map, the American Jewish community, by and large, said, well, the Israelis are a bit stubborn, and if the Palestinians and the Israelis can make peace, everything will go away. And then when that wasn't happening, when Arafat walked away, and when scholars started looking at how the Brotherhood was active in different parts of the region, and anti-Semitism started attacking Jews in France and in Brussels. And even though they were talking about the Zionist Israelis, on Shabbat in Paris and in Brussels, you needed paramilitary police to go to shul. And then it started going to the United Kingdom and to Canada. But here, we were different. And I remember going with a colleague, Larry Amsel, professor of psychiatry at Columbia University. We were in the AJC building, and this is in 2003. And he remarked how every Jewish organization in New York City doesn't have a sign. It has bulletproof glasses. It has, diplomatic double-doored security, and as we walk through the door here, everything is X-rayed. And there was bricks in front of the AJC building. And every other community, every other church, every other business, if you make it in New York, you put the sign in neon lights, because if you make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. And yet, we were kind of going incognito, but at the same time saying we don't have a problem. And then it started impacting more, the religious communities around New York, but so we were different. And I think that there was, as Martin Luther King said during the Civil Rights Movement, that we were sleeping through a revolution. Martin Luther King was referring to the fact that universities, schools, and churches on Sundays were the most segregated space in America in that hour. But that young people going to music, doing sports, and socializing, that there was a revolution happening, and that the major institutions were not keeping up with the revolution. They were sleeping through the revolution. And I think we were sleeping through the revolution. In 1983, Edward Said famously said, Edward Said is a very important literary critic, philosopher. He claims to be Palestinian, never spoke Arabic, disconnected from his culture, but okay. He embodied the struggle for Palestinians, professor at Columbia University. And in 1983, he famously said that he was the last Jewish intellectual, the last remaining Jewish intellectual, that he was the inheritor to the Frankfurt School of Thought, which was a very important philosophical movement that was created by Holocaust survivors. Holocaust survivors who made it to this country. They came up with a very important framework for understanding society. And Said said that he was the last Jewish intellectual, that he was the inheritor to this, amazing contribution to knowledge and philosophy and wisdom. And that he went on to say that Jewish scholars became fat scribes in the suburbs of America, that the Palestinians were the Jews, and that the Israelis and the Jews were the Nazis. When he said this in 1983, people thought he was disconnected from reality, or he had a bad day. But this, ladies and gentlemen, is the predominant discourse at the best universities in this country. This is the discourse that teaches young people go to universities to learn how to be citizens. Professors in this environment are teaching young Americans that Jews are white supremacists, they're apartheid supporters, and they're Nazis. And if you've been through the university system, this has been going on for decades. And we know that our enemies understand that if you change the curriculum, if you manipulate young people at universities, and now it's happening here through K through 12 as well, across the country, courses for children are being rewritten in this country. If you change the education system, where young people learn to be professors and captains of industry and politicians and journalists, then you transform the society. And the institutionalization of genocidal anti-Semitism in the United States of America today, at the institutions that are grooming the future generation, is endemic. It's endemic. And I don't know how you reverse this. Now, I spoke earlier about about the Muslim Brotherhood. The spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood is a gentleman named Yusuf Qaradawi. Qaradawi preached, the most important spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, preached his entire life that the true believer, the true Muslim, is obligated to complete the work of Hitler. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, Yusuf Qaradawi and the Muslim Brotherhood were brought to the United Kingdom, welcomed by the royal family, by the establishment, the Labour Party establishment, and the fancy ladies and gentlemen of the United Kingdom. And he started the most important Islamic studies program in the Western world at Oxford University, where I went to school. The British took this person's money, Saudi money at the time, but now it's Qatari money. They took millions and millions of pounds in the Oxbridges of the world, of the Sorbonne, and in this country. The research that we're doing at our institute, we've found, and we have a great team of forensic accountants and terror financiers, but we're a small research group. We found over $100 billion, with a B, coming from the Muslim Brotherhood, undocumented, unreported as it must be in this country according to the American law, and it's going to our best universities. We found 10 billion went to Cornell, 1.3 went to Texas A&M, and Texas A&M gave the intellectual property rights to the Qatari regime who paid for this. Qatar represents the Muslim Brotherhood. The leaders of Qatar have a spiritual oath, a bayah in Islam that it's called, where they follow all of the religious edicts and rulings of the Brotherhood. Texas A&M had 502 research projects. We flagged 58 of these projects have military purposes, 13 have nuclear military research implications. Qatar has great relations with the Iranian revolutionary regime, with the Taliban. They still house the leadership of Hamas, which is the Palestinian chapter of the Brotherhood. This is happening here, in your midst. So this is the institutionalization, the selling of our souls, the selling of liberal academia, liberal education to the Muslim Brotherhood or to the highest bidder. And a part of this process is bringing anti-Semitism to the very core of this country. And as Elie Wiesel said, anti-Semitism begins with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. This is a threat not just to the Jewish people. This is a threat to democracy. This is a threat to the future of this country. And this is a social movement that is not only anti-Semitic, they're sexist, they believe in subjugating women, they're homophobic, they want to destroy democracy, they want to destroy Israel, the little Satan, and destroy this country, the big Satan. And our universities are doing business with them. It's astounding.
Okay. I'm going to ask, gentlemen, that we kind of step back from the university for a moment. We're going to go back in history. And I will note to both of you that in the May session, when we're dealing with anti-Semitism on the university and college campuses, Carrie Nelson will be one of the speakers. So we will be covering this and possibly some suggestions for changes in the university as well. He's just come out with a blockbuster of a piece on his suggestions for this. So let's talk about the protocols of the Elders of Zion. David, you had mentioned them when you mentioned Hamas. Just to give people a bit of a background, they're first published in an obscure newspaper in Imperial Russia in 1903. But they have, as they say in Hollywood, legs. And they go around the world in multiple languages, in multiple editions, in multiple forms. One of the things that they purport to do is to talk about a Jewish plot for global domination. So can you talk about the elements of the protocols that you see in today's anti-Semitic attacks and how they have been passed down? But let's talk society generally and less campus related. And I don't think that that's any problem given how widely they're accepted.
Yeah, you mentioned Hamas. The Hamas charter cites 3 sources to prove the truth of what the charter states: the Quran, the Hadith, and the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So it's become like scripture in many circles. The protocols, the notes taken during a secret meeting of the leaders of the Jewish people, plotting to take over the world, banks, entertainment, and communication centers, published in 1903 in Russia, as you mentioned. But it's a text that embodies what drives anti-Semitism to a large extent. The Jew is ubiquitous and invisible. The Jews are everywhere. They're plotting everywhere. They're as invisible as Satan, and just as threatening. I once had a student say, well, what if the Jews did take over the world? What would be so bad about that? But it's an evil takeover, and the premise is not that all Jews are evil, but all evil is Jewish. And the Protocols feeds that phobia. The Protocols became widely translated following the First World War, right, into the languages of Europe, translated into Arabic in 1926, I believe, because it helped to explain the catastrophe that the First World War was. How could this have happened? First World War was an upheaval in human consciousness about evil, carnage, our capacity for destruction and death. And the Jews are behind it. It has to be the Jews. Just like it's similar to blood libel, what preys on the soul, what preys on your salvation, what threatens your redemption, what threatens your presence in the world. It's the Jews. So that's what drives a lot of the anti-Zionism. I mean, Israel, the state of Israel is the Jew among the nations. How often you've heard this? If it weren't for Israel, there would be peace in the Middle East, right? Is that, you mean like in Syria and Iraq and Iran, Afghanistan? Is that peace like that? So the Hamas Charter says that the Jews have a hand in every single war. This is actually out of the Protocols is where they get this. So it's an explanation for evil. The problem of evil has a perfectly clear answer. It's the Jews. And now we can assure our salvation as a society, ideologically, religiously. I mean, the Protocols lends itself to all these tropes, right? Bestseller, not just in the jihadist world, but throughout the Muslim world and other parts of the world. Russia. The Russian church is still selling Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So the attraction is that it provides you with answers when you're faced with something you can't explain, I think.
Charles, can you speak a little bit more about that, please, and about the staying power, but also talk about who conspiratorially does it speak to?
So look, I think, it shouldn't be lost on us here. Here we are sitting in a Holocaust museum. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion played an integral role in sort of laying the foundation to remove Jews from society and to the final solution. And we always, growing up, I grew up in Montreal, in my generation, we thought this was something, of a distant universe, a distant past, and we've come a long way. But here we are. And I think if I can speak on a political level, in the 1980s, there was structural adjustment. So you have radical Islam that wants to destroy the state, and then you have neoliberalism that wants to weaken the state. Right? There was this belief that if the state is not as invested in our economy, if the state steps back and allows free market system to go, there'll be more economic development, and with more economic development, there was a belief there'll be more democracy. So you have neoliberals wanting to weaken the state, and you have Islamists that want to destroy the state because they see it as a vestige of Western imperialism and colonialism. So you have these two tremendous forces basically out to destroy or weaken the state. And in this vacuum, I grew up in Montreal. I went to a good university. I went to McGill University, which could compete with any decent Ivy League university in the United States. I paid $200 Canadian, $125 a year to go to school, Where, here you pay, what, 80, 70, 80, $90,000 a year. So it was the state provided education, the state provided health care, transportation, unemployment insurance. The state was involved in the economy and into society. And the state, in other parts of the world, say in the Middle East, it wasn't as impactful as a Canadian social democracy. But in Egypt, for example, there was the provision of basic goods and services, food subsidies, sugar, flour, basic education, basic health care. And when the state withdrew, or the state, under structural adjustment, Islamists came in and they took over institutions and places where it was once controlled by the state. The Muslim Brotherhood came in and started providing services like education and started teaching people the protocols. And then we in the West, in the United States, we go get our money from the people that are preaching the same thing. So you have this political and economic crisis where Islamists and anti-democratic forces using the protocols are becoming more and more powerful. And this is sort of among the displaced, among the political, marginalized, culturally marginalized places in much of the world, in societies where the state is weakening to the point where states are failing. There's a migration crisis, there's a deep crisis, and political Islam, with the protocols, are teaching young people now for decades throughout the world. So the protocols have kind of reignited with the masses, if you will, across the world. And then, forgive me, I'm going to go back to the universities, but the universities in this free market system, where the state is not providing the resources to run the universities, the state are going now to corporations and to other countries looking for money. And it was with the Saudis, now with the Qataris, that they're also pushing a Muslim Brotherhood ideology and agenda which is rooted in the protocols. Rooted. This is not the military wing or the extreme element. This is a core element of their worldview. And they know our society. They speak our language, they know our culture, they know our political system. We in the West don't speak Arabic, we don't study the Quran, we don't know the culture. We think if we're nice to people, they'll be nice to us, right? And but sometimes people have deep, heavy beliefs. I eat kosher, right? It's an irrational, if you think it's deeply cultural, it's irrational. If somebody offered me money to eat pork, I couldn't do it. It's deeply rooted in me. It's not, so sometimes if you give people money, they're not going to change their ways. And what the Muslim Brotherhood is doing in a systematic way is influencing our society. They're buying our universities, and you can go to our website. We have many reports on this, which is really highly well-researched, serious documentation, which we're trying to have an impact on policy and education, raising awareness, is that if they're buying universities, they're buying the media, and they're changing our culture with, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, with a genocidal, anti-Semitic social movement rooted in the protocols. And their goal is to destroy Israel, to move Israel away from the United States and the West, to isolate and weaken it. Hamas was the spearhead of this movement. Maybe they moved a few years too quickly, but this was their goal, to destroy the little Satan and to use anti-Semitism, and this is their strategic goal stated 40 years ago, which we don't know in the West, to use anti-Semitism to fragment and weaken the United States of America, to destroy the big Satan. And as far-fetched as this sounds, it started in the classroom, it goes to the encampment, it's now in our streets, and it's in our media. And this is really an attack, not just on the Jews, but on American democratic principles. And this is how the protocols worked. We've seen this movie before, 2 generations ago. It's here.
So the question remains, why are Americans and Westerners so receptive to this, A, and B, susceptible to it at the same time? But before I get to that, I'd like you to wrap that into a little bit more about the protocols. Specifically, given that the protocols claim to be this report of Jewish attempts or efforts to dominate the world, but they claim very specifically to be the report of a conference or a convention that was held in 1897, which is the first meeting of the World Zionist Congress. I mean, so we're coming full circle at this point. So before we get into that, David, could you give me briefly the history of Zionism while standing on one foot, and you've got 2 minutes, go. No, but we have to talk about that before we can talk about anti-Zionism. We have to talk about Zionism. What is Zionism?
Well, what are anti-Zionists? Anti, exactly.
First,
right.
talk about what Zionism is.
Okay, very briefly and simply, Zionism in the modern period is a movement to seek a haven for the Jews. After Theodor Herzl covered the Alfred Dreyfus affair, 1894 in France, violence breaking out against Jews all over France and elsewhere in Western Europe, he came to the conclusion that, as he put it, Jews will never be safe as long as they're guests in somebody else's house. And this is at the end of a century of promise and hope. Somehow we can fit in. The universities are opening their doors, the professions. Usually if you abandon your Judaism, you can, as Heinrich Heine found out, you can get through the door. But next thing you know, you got pogroms, certainly in Eastern Europe. The Jewish Haskalah or Enlightenment movement was fizzling out by the 1880s. They realized that they're never going to fit in. And finally, Herzl, who's not a particularly fromm Jew, right? He saw the condition of the Jews in Europe, 1894, and he came to this conclusion: we have to find not just a land of our own, but a haven, someplace where we can go without fear of being attacked. And he thought that this would solve anti-Semitism. Just take us out of Europe, give us our own land, and people will stop hating us. Of course, he was mistaken. So the Zionist movement went through various stages within the Jewish world, between the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world. The British Mandate assisted that early on. But by the end of the 30s, the British, who were in control of so-called Palestine, started closing their doors to the Jews, Jewish immigration. And when the British bailed on the Jews in 1948, I think the British thought this would be the end of the Jews in Palestine. You got the Arab armies ready to attack, and somehow the Jews had the wisdom to declare independence, to get organized, to resist, and see to it that Israel becomes a place where you can wear a kippah without looking over your shoulder, which is not true even in much of the U.S. So, and we know that the history of the Jewish state is a history of rescuing Jews. Yemenite, Ethiopian, Soviet, Iraqi. When the Jews were kicked out of the Arab countries in the 50s after the War of Independence, like 850,000 plus, where did they have to go? Where could they go? Many of them went to Israel. Holocaust survivors went to Israel. Jews who had no place to go went to Israel. And recently, during the French Aliyah, the Jews leaving France to go to Israel, I saw an interview with a French Jew who moved to Israel, said, sometimes it can be dangerous here. Why'd you come here? And he said, here in Israel, when you call the police, they come. In France, they don't. Israel continues to be a haven for the Jewish people, thank God.
I am going to jump ahead a bit in what we were going to talk about because I want to try and wrap up by around 8 so that Michael can say a few words, and then we're going to have all three of you responding to audience questions. So we've... that's about Zionism, but also about, and maybe we'll leave it here, how and why does anti-Zionist rhetoric resonate with both the far right and the far left? I mean, it's this thing of beauty where it doesn't matter where somebody stands on the ends of the political spectrum, they can still agree to hate Jews and Israel. So please talk about that.
So again, I think anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, is deeply rooted in Western civilization, as I said at the beginning. There's the three phases of anti-Semitism. But I want to talk about Zionism for a moment. And I think Zionism, to me, and I think to the Jewish people, is the greatest movement of the emancipation and the reclaiming of the indigenous people on their land. It's astounding. Despite Islam, despite Christianity, despite the British, despite all these empires, we have been able in our lifetime, which is an incredible miracle, to have a free, sovereign homeland for the Jewish people where we speak our language, we connect to our land. You know, I'll just tell a quick story. I was very active with indigenous people in northern Canada, and I brought a group of chiefs to Israel. They stayed with me in Jerusalem. And to see Israel through their eyes was, you know, how they saw how our holidays are rooted to the land. All of our holidays. Passover is coming, Pesach. In Jewish thought, and you know, we have one project we do in ISGAP is Jewish consciousness. One of my mentor, Shengia Ragavan, was a South African anti-apartheid activist, and he was one of the founders of the Black Consciousness movement. He conscientized, as I said, Stephen Biko and other young people in Natal. And you know, what the people in South Africa did, you know, the British, the Europeans came and they said, you know, white is positive and superior and black is negative and inferior. And what the Black Consciousness movement did is they rejected this paradigm and they went back to their roots, to their cosmology, their connection to the land, their wisdom, their you know, the wisdom, their learnings of their elders. And that was a way for them to redefine themselves and reject this sort of racist apartheid system. And we have a program based on this experience that I went through called Jewish Consciousness, where it is time to stop responding simply by the people, our enemies. There are enemies defining us. We're not white, we get killed. We are white, we're the oppressor. We're not Christian, it's enough. Jewish wisdom, one of the blessings that we have despite being exiled and colonized, is that, you know, you can pull out your phone, and on our phone, we have access to the Torah, to the Talmud, to the Mishnah, to the teachings of our rabbis. We have all of thousands of years of incredible wisdom and insight at our fingertips, at our yeshivas. You know, it's incredible. And we have to go back and define ourselves based on Jewish values. And, you know, Professor Patterson and I, we speak about this a lot. One of my, you know, philosophical inspirations is Professor Emmanuel Levinas. Emmanuel Levinas came from Lithuania. He studied in France, and when he was in France studying, his entire family in Lithuania were exterminated by the Nazis. He survived because he was in France. And basically, he brought Jewish thought to the university, to the academy, and going back to the university. For the first time, he wasn't simply a Jewish professor. He was a Jewish professor who brought Jewish wisdom to the philosophy departments. And one of the things that in Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers, it's a profound thing. And Levinas was the master of this philosophy. Based on our teachings and our wisdom, he said that the moment we see our face in the face of the other, the moment we see our face in the face of the other, this is the instant we become human. This is not tolerance, this condescending concept of tolerance. In Judaism, we need the other. We're all from the same source. We need the other to be a human being. So if I'm racist, I've eliminated 1 billion possibilities for me to become a human being, for me to become wise. If I'm sexist, I've, you know, given up over 50% of the possibilities for me to become a human being and to become wise. It's profound ethics. These are our teachings. And I'll just say one more thing. As Passover comes, we're on the eve of Passover, which is a story of our freedom to Israel, to the land of Israel. This is not, colonizing by white people. This is our living history. And we have to remember that in Jewish thought, there are 4 exiles. The Egyptian exile is slavery. That's number 1. The Persians, we celebrate Purim. That's physical annihilation when the people wanted to exterminate us, genocide us. Then there were the Greeks who said we could live on the land, but we can't remember our God. We have to accept their God. That's assimilation. And Edom, the Europeans. In our teachings of what it is to be in exile, Jewish worldview, it says that Edom, Rome, Europe, will be the greatest exile that goes to deeper than the depth of the deepest part of the sea. And it will encompass slavery, or include slavery, assimilation, and annihilation. And yet, in this moment, we have, through Zionism, reconnected and reestablished our homeland. And you can get these intellectual clowns who say we're white colonizers, whatever. That's fine, let them define us. But I think we as a community, particularly young people, have to connect to this incredibly deep, profound wisdom. I sit at a yeshiva of my friend Akiva Zweig, who David knows, who's a rabbi. He's the head of a yeshiva in Miami. I can sit with him, and I've studied with great philosophers. I went to great universities. I can sit with Akiva for months, reading 3 lines in the Torah, and going deep into it, and just drawing on the wisdom. And we have to teach, particularly young people, that we have to define ourselves based on who we are, not what our enemies keep telling everybody who and what we are. It's not true. And we have to reconnect to ourselves. And the tragedy of the American Jewish community, if I may, is that we have become so removed from our wisdom and from our teachings and from our connection to who we are spiritually and physically in the land. For a Jew to be free, you have to be rooted in the land of Israel and connected to something higher. This is our teachings. We're white, we're not white, we're colonizers, we're apartheid. It's part of my English, it's BS. We have such a great wisdom, and this is how we have to be proud and free based on the wisdom of who we are. And the land of Israel, with the heritage and the wisdom and the what has come out of that land, and as a wellspring, not just for the Jewish people, but for the entire world. And it continues to be an inspiration for the entire world. Maybe not at the Ivy League universities, but I'll tell you, throughout the world, it's resonating.
Okay, let's leave it there. Thank you both very much. And I would like to invite to the stage Dr. Michael Berenbaum, who will give brief remarks.
First of all, I've traveled about 9 or 10 hours just to give a 5-minute speech. But there's only one criteria for a good flight, and that is that it lands. Let me do the following. Since I was not privileged to hear my colleagues, let me give you an overview of the way I see it. If you want to understand anti-Semitism, you have to understand 4 words. You have to understand source, goal, priority, stability. The sources of anti-Semitism differ: religious, political, economic, social, cultural, racial. Depending on what the source is, the goal differs. If you have religious anti-Semitism, you want conversion. If you have political anti-Semitism, you want to diminish Jewish power. If you have social anti-Semitism, you want to isolate the Jews in some which way. If you have cultural anti-Semitism, you want to eliminate them from the cultural life of the nation. If you have racial anti-Semitism, we saw that, with all due respect to Whoopi Goldberg, we saw that in Nazism, where the goal ultimately was annihilation. It can result in expulsion, it can be a whole range of things, but if it's racial, it was defined on the basis of blood. The third element, so that's source and goal. The third element, which is absolutely pivotal, is priority. One of the reasons Jews have been safe in the United States of America is that we have never been the number one priority for exclusion and for discrimination. We can all list a whole range of other peoples who are higher on the list of priority, and I would say we can even list today a whole range of people who are higher on the range of priority. The major exception may be the college campuses at this moment, and even that is a particular thing. The last is stability. That's an axiom. The more stable a society is, the more secure its Jewish community. The other part of that is the less stable a society is, the less stable its Jewish community. Having said that, we also have to see that stability gives an excuse for singling out people, for scapegoating people. And stability also, the Jews have become the equivalent of what Yitz Greenberg refers to as the canary in the mine. Why do you put a canary in the mine if there's no oxygen? The canary feels it first, the miners know to get the hell out. If you have a problem and the Jews are targeted, then you understand the society itself is unstable. What is the difference now between these forms of anti-Semitism and what we have today? And the answer is this, which is that we have the combination of the internet, which means you can broadcast widely and globally for very little expense, and you have an audience, you have the social networks, which means you develop a community of people who reinforce the whole range of ways in which you are thinking, and that spurs itself into a global movement all the way through. A word about Zionism, which we have to say, is that Zionism, in one respect, opposition to Zionism is opposition to the way in which the Jews have chosen to shape their future. This is what we found in when the Roman Catholic Church with Nostra Aetate recognized 1,878 years of Jewish history, and when John Paul II established diplomatic relations with Israel, he essentially came to terms with the ways in which Jews have defined themselves ever since. So a plurality of the Jewish people live in Israel today. It is the largest Jewish community in the world, not so when it was founded, not so in the preceding years, but the migration means that the opposition is the opposition to the way in which Jews have defined themselves and chosen for their future. What is the existential crisis afflicting the Jewish people? Here we have to go back to history. In 1945, Jews made 3 decisions, and by that I'm talking about in the way in which they behaved. The first decision they made was to remain Jews. Not all Jews did that. I had a very distinguished colleague by the name of Madeleine Albright, and I joked that I taught at Georgetown with Madeleine Albright. I knew Madeleine Albright before she was Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright's family, and Madeleine was a brilliant woman who understood intuitively that Jewishness was the third rail of her family's experience without knowing it. And how did she discover that her ancestors, her grandparents were Jewish? Even though she had Jewish cousins, she saw them on a wall of the deportees in Prague. When I first met her, she described her parents as Czechoslovakian nationalists and social democrats. Czechoslovakian nationalists and social democrats was another way of saying Jewish, because you had Czech nationalists and Slovakian nationalists, and the Jews were linked to a Czechoslovakian nationalism. Most Jews decided to remain Jews. If you want an example of it, and I'm going to give you an example of it because it shows you the risk involved. I interviewed a man by the name of Rabbi Arnold Weider. Arnold Weider was the mole in Boston, and because Boston loves the New York Yankees so much, he had the reputation as being known as the Yankee Clipper. with no apologies to Joe DiMaggio. I asked him, where did you learn to be a mole? And he said, I learned to be a mole in Bergen-Belsen. And then I scratched my head and I said, this is incredible. For 6 years, if Jewish men were forced to lower their trousers, they were killed. And on the 7th year, they dared, without knowing where they would live, what the world was going to be like, they dared to make an indelible mark on their sons. That's a commitment to the Jewish future, equivalent of saying, in the words of tradition, Na'aseh v'nishma, we're going to do it, and then we'll see what the hell happens. Second decision that we made was the Zionist option, what Yehuda Bauer called the Zionist option, which is that Jews saw that they were a non-European element. They thought that the normalization of the Jewish condition would be what? In having a state, an army, a flag, and the land. And the third decision that we made was a decision for those of us who continue to live in the diaspora, was that our future would be in a democracy that protected human rights, human dignity, that protected freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and all of that. And that among the freedoms it defended was the freedom of Jews to live as Jews. And for most of the last 50, 60 years, we have enjoyed the fruits of that. What is our existential crisis today? Our existential crisis today is that option number 2 and option number 3 do not appear to be secure. And consequently, we feel an existential crisis. And the existential crisis is a very important existential crisis because it charts the direction. What do we have to do? One of the things we have to do, our grandparents accepted, my great-grandparents accepted the notion in Yiddish, it's difficult to be a Jew. For my generation, it wasn't difficult to be a Jew. I could be a Jew in public, I could be a Jew in private. I faced no barriers for it. We have to teach and educate ourselves and the next generation about the majesty, the mystery, the glory, the sacredness, the sanctity of being Jewish, so they are capable of assuming the burden, because they are going to live in a world in which being Jewish is a burden, and they're going to live in a world in which the other will define them as Jewish, even if they do not want it to be. Last point, essentially, the opposition, Zionism was also, before it was a haven, Zionism was the desire of the Jews to be a normal people in their own land, which was essentially denied them by defeat, but we never lost the connection to the land and the connection to that as being somewhat, in a very existential way, the place from which we came and the place to which we shall return. Exile and return is the dominant theme in all of Jewish life, even in secular manifestations by Jews. And we have lived in a world in which there is exile and return, and we have had this notion of return. The interesting thing is the desire to return was spurred by anti-Semitism and was spurred by the failure of emancipation. Emancipation, we thought that the Jews could gain their rights as Jews and to participate fully. It was twice born. It was born in 1881. It was born in 1897. And essentially it was because emancipation did not what? Did not yield the promise of full acceptance. The question then becomes for our generation is, will Jews be secure in their land? And what is the cost? What is the existential angst involved in being secure? That's the dilemma of our generation, and that's the moment that we face at this time.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, I have some audience questions, and you have certainly gotten people thinking. Okay, so let's start with this one. This one is a question about social media. They're talking about X and Telegram and all kinds of support for anti-Semitism on these social media platforms, and they would like to know what is it specifically about social media that allows anti-Semitism to thrive and even possibly creates anti-Semitic space. Let's, again, Michael, because you just spoke, let's do Charles, and then let's do David, and then we'll come back to Michael.
So in ISGAP, we have a social media team, and I think this is the beginning of the end of civilization. But it's an important part of our world. Look, I think Michael Kotler, who's the ambassador on anti-Semitism for Israel, basically said that social media is sort of the super spreader of a virus. It's an anti-Semitic virus, but it's also an attack on human decency. I'm not an expert on social media, but in many social democracies, there's legislation against hate speech. And what's happened in this country with the First Amendment is that companies from all over the world, companies and entities from radical Islamist, anti-democratic countries around the world set up their URLs and their domains in the United States because of the First Amendment. And these are people that live in societies that believe in subjugating women. Afghanistan, for example, it's now illegal for a woman to speak in public, right? And this is that these people representing these type of entities are now setting up in the United States. So I think there should be laws against hate speech, and there should be some form of regulation, and it's dangerous.
Yeah, social media is the opposite of the social, just as Facebook is the opposite of the face. We turn to social media because there's no accountability. Our humanity lies in our responsibility. To be a human being is to be the one responsible. So there's no limiting principle, basically, as to what you can say, what you can incite. There's no answerability. There's no reckoning. Social media is a great place to hide. Just like Adam hid when God asked, well, where are you? He went into hiding because he was afraid. He was afraid to be held accountable, to answer, here I am. So social media is the realm of absence. When the human being is absent, hatred flourishes, starting with the Jews, but not ending with the Jews. Because the Jews, as I mentioned earlier, insist on responsibility, being asked, where are you? Where's your brother? What have you done?
The incredible thing is that we've lost on social media. And that is that even though we have enormous skill, Israel is supposedly a startup nation with all sorts of incredible technological achievements. We've been outmanned, outgunned, and out-hated on social media. Part of what we have to say, we live in a climate, and this is a general point, we live in a climate in which if you hate, you feel empowered to express that hatred. And that is that I can document that the percentage of anti-Semitism, of anti-Semites, has declined significantly since the 40s and the 50s. What is the difference? And by the way, and also the number of, the percentage of overt racists has declined dramatically. What is the difference, which is astounding, is that we lived in a period of time, and I grew up in a period of time, in which we were sanitized from the expression of that hatred because you didn't want to be identified with the Nazis. America had fought a war against that. The greatest generation had returned. We didn't want to be identified with that. What happens is the social media is a forum for radical expressions of hatred and fury, in part because you don't have to say it directly to another human being, and you're protected with anonymity. And you're protected from having to say it directly. Remember, we sometimes have the idea, say it to my face. And that's the danger of social media, and that's the fury. And the other part of it is we live in a world in which any discussion of Israel, anti-Semitism, and the like is complex. And 140 characters is not a place in which you express any degree of complexity, any degree of nuance. And the reward is for being the most radical, the most outrageous, the most venomous, and the most hated.
Okay. Actually, let's start with David, and then Charles, and then Michael. You discussed, and by you, we mean David and Charles, because this was before you took the stage, Michael. But you discussed anti-Semitism in politicized and ideologized Islam, and you talked about the radical left. Can you discuss anti-Semitism on the far right? Because you didn't really pick that up, and I think we would be remiss, if, as this person says, if we don't deal with that as well.
Yes. It's there, of course. The far right is operational. Very few professors in academia identify as far right. Very few people in Congress who say anti-Zionist things identify as far right. So they're not as visible. But the Aryan nation is still around. Remnants of KKK still around. Frankly, I don't know. I really have no idea how active they are in social media. They may be. I'm not. It's outside of my sphere of exposure to what's going on. But it would be, I think, a serious mistake to ignore it. As always, it's a mistake to ignore expressions of hatred. There's no such thing as minor or marginal hatred. So we have to be watchful. But it's, as I said, it's not as appealing. One difference is on the far right, they brag about being anti-Semites. On the far left, they deny being anti-Semites. So both of which are very dangerous positions, but right now on the far left, it's much more appealing to our youth, to the people in the encampments, for example. It holds out the promise of redemption. If you can be counted among the righteous, maybe from both directions have their redemptive aspect. Anti-Semitism is often redemptive, whether it's from the left or the right. But I would never say it's not there. It is there, and it would be a mistake to act like it isn't there.
Charles?
Yeah, so I'll say briefly, it's a very important point and question, so thanks for raising it. So basically, and I was saying earlier, there's an attack on the democratic center because of we call it the crisis of modernity. There's a global crisis in the economy. Nation states are failing. There's a migration crisis. So the radical left, the radical right, and political Islam, very different social movements, use anti-Semitism as a core element. So in terms of anti-Semitism, this is very dangerous, and there's an attack on the democratic center. And David and I were speaking more in the sort of intellectual space with the Red-Green Alliance, which is very important. But equally important is the attack by the right. And you can see the rise of racism, the rise of nationalism, of white supremacy, of nationalist movements, of xenophobia, of anti-migration sentiment in this country and in many countries in the world. And I'd say this is part and parcel of the crisis that we're living in. So the extremists are attacking the democratic center and human decency, and the right-wing white supremacy, racist kind of nationalism in North America, but parts of Europe and other places in the world is very troubling and very serious.
Michael?
I think we have to look at the problem of Christian nationalism. We have to also look at, there's a way in which we normally think of right and left as in this way. Right and left may be able to be perceived as sort of U-shaped. And if you think of it as U-shaped, then the magnet between the two sides, which cannot join because of the issue of immigration, can join because of the issue of anti-Semitism. And the other element is that the mainstream signals to the extreme a measure of support. And we have to look at that. You saw it with Elon Musk and Steve Bannon, which is that one should hesitate to think of coming to the edge, denying that it's a Nazi salute and all of that. So you have anti-Semitism of both dimensions. You also, by the way, one of the issues that you have, even with the greatest supporters of the State of Israel, evangelicals, at the greatest supporters of the government of Israel. I don't necessarily regard them as supporters of the State of Israel, but I do regard them as supporters of the government of Israel, because they believe essentially that the return of the Jews to the land is the precursor to the return of Jesus as the Christ. And that means that in a certain level, they believe at one point or another, the Jews are going to become what is historically known as a witness people. And St. Augustine is the one who claimed that Jews have to survive as a witness people, because who better to give voice to Jesus as the Christ than the people who denied Jesus as the Christ and went on and continued without that. So the evangelicals, we are in a temporary alliance. The temporary alliance may be for centuries, but there may come a moment in which the Jews are blamed for the delay in the second coming. And that's going to be a very dangerous moment for the Jewish people on the religious right.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, I have 3 more questions, and then I will invite Mary Pat back to the stage. But these 3 questions are one for each individual on the stage. So the first question is for you, Michael. How would you respond to the argument, and I know this is near and dear to your heart, that teaching about the Holocaust presents Jews as victims and that it is counterproductive for living Jews?
First of all, I believe that I'm going to give you my sense of the importance of the Holocaust. The greatest narrative of the Jewish people is the narrative of the Exodus. And the narrative of the Exodus is we remember we were slaves because we remember what we did in the aftermath of slavery. In the aftermath of slavery, we made it the universal story of liberation. And we also gave it an ethical dimension, so that if you read the Torah, the whole range of commandments that are given because we were slaves in the land of Egypt, including the way in which we have the Sabbath, including how we treat others, including the sensitivity to the widow and the orphan and those who are less. So we've made it the ethical norm, and we remember our past. What has this generation of survivors done that is comparable to the biblical generation, which is they have made the Holocaust the universal story, a particular story that is universal, a particular story of anguish and suffering, of degradation and destruction, but also the second half of that, which is the capacity to rebuild in its aftermath and to transform victimization into witness, into moral witness, into witness for humanity, into witness for decency, for morality, for the acceptance of what Charles spoke of, the innate dignity of every single human being. That is an achievement of this past generation that, to my mind, is comparable to the way in which the Jewish people, we moralize in a very deep way, is comparable to the way in which the Jewish people responded to the Exodus and responded to the experience of slavery and the like. But let me give you an image which we have to think of at this point. There's a great legend when Israel stood at the sea. The scripture is very specific. The Jews stood at the sea and they entered the sea on dry land amidst the sea. The rabbis asked the question, how can it be dry land amidst the sea? If it's dry land, it's not amidst the sea. If it's amidst the sea, it's not dry land. So they came up with two treatments in Midrash. One is the Israelites stood on the edge of the sea. Nobody wanted to, and everybody fought to enter, and they fought to enter, and nobody could go first, so they stood stagnant. Then one man by the name of Nachshon ben Aminadav jumped in, and only when the sea reached his nostrils did they begin to part. So that's how you walk on amidst the sea, in dry land amidst the sea. Emil Fackenheim said that the story of our generation is welcome, my fellow swimmers. It's not a laughter, it's an anguish.
Okay, thank you. Charles, this question is for you from one of the members of the audience. This person says that the cultural DNA of both Jews and African Americans have been aligned forces for social progress in the civil rights era and beyond. Do you think that this partnership can sustain the current crisis?
It's a good question. I wish I had an easy answer. Look, apropos of both communities share a connection to the story of Exodus. I on a personal level, I was very active in the anti-apartheid movement. I was the chairperson of the ANC Solidarity Committee, and worked with the leadership of the ANC in the 1980s and 90s. And so the connection is deep. The contradictions today in the United States are profound. The communities are alienated from each other. There's, in terms of in popular culture, in the African American artistic community, there's a lot of deep anti-Semitism. There's racism in the Jewish community. There's alienation between the two communities. There's efforts trying to bring people together, which is wonderful. I think in this crisis of anti-Semitism since October the 7th, there's been, church groups and different groups trying to, work together on dealing with anti-Semitism and the rise of racism and xenophobia. I have the privilege to work with Dr. Benjamin Chavez and some other people who are in the spirit of Joseph Lieberman, trying to do some work together to bring the communities together. It's an uphill battle. There's a lot of mistrust, but I think it's incumbent that we take the best of both of our legacies and our culture and work together. I think both communities really need support. This is really a crisis that certainly the Jewish community is in. The African American community has serious issues that it's confronting with. The society as a whole is perhaps in crisis. So there are some good people and efforts being made, and I hope they'll continue to work together and develop. It would be very important if both communities could take a leadership role in confronting the injustices and hatred that seems to be, running amok in this country. So I'm hopeful, but it's a serious challenge.
Okay. David, final question, and I'd like to invite Mary Pat back to the stage. The final question is, for all the money, what can we do as individuals to combat anti-Semitism?
What can we do as individuals? One thing the Jews can do as individuals is to be Jews. As Charles was saying earlier, don't allow those who hate us to define who we are, which is typical in instances of anti-Semitism throughout history. Be Jews, embrace this profound and beautiful tradition of Jewish wisdom, teaching, and testimony. Don't apologize for being Jews. Rejoice in Judaism, as my friends here have suggested. And finally, do not stand idly by your brother's blood. as for the rest of humanity, the Jews are chosen to say to every human, you are chosen. You are a child of God. You come into the world with a mission and are entrusted with a testimony. No one can stand silently by their brother's blood, because every other human being is my brother, my sister, my mother, my father, my son, my daughter. Humanity is family. So we can raise our own consciousness and awareness of that connection. Anti-Semitism is about a radical disconnection. Jewish teaching is about a radical connection. We all come from one and not from two individuals, so that no one can say to his neighbor, my side of the family is better than yours. There's only one side of the family. Finally, name the evil. Name the evil. When you see a terrorist run over people in New Orleans, say who this person is, where this person's from, what this person's agenda might be. Don't just say a terrorist ran over some people. What does that mean? So, and often we're afraid to name the evil. If we don't name it, we can't see it. So what we can do is open our eyes, our ears, and give thanks. Yehudi, the word for Jew, means one who is grateful. Our humanity, I suggested earlier, lies in our responsibility, and our first response is when Jews wake up every morning is Modeh Ani, thank you. I give thanks to you. Rejoice. For each of us is entrusted with something infinitely precious. It's placed in our hands. It's on our lips and on our tongue. It's very nigh unto us to do it. So I'm actually optimistic.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you, David. David, Charles, Michael, I'm grateful for each of you and thankful for sharing your wisdom with us. We've just barely scratched the surface. We could have spent much more time with you, but I'm grateful for your being here. Michael, thanks for spending 9 hours commuting to Dallas. We really appreciate it. Please remember that this is part one. We've mentioned several times the second part of this series that will be on May 13th, focused on anti-Semitism in college campuses. If you know people that missed tonight, please let them know that this has been recorded and will be posted on the museum's YouTube channel. So it's the initials of the museum, DHHRM YouTube channel, and you'll be able to see and listen to, and hopefully we'll all re-listen and hear things that we didn't hear tonight, but it can also prepare people for the second part of our series. I appreciate you being here. We're grateful for you. Have a safe night, safe trip home.